All right. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Here we are in our session number 18. There's a few people coming in right now, so let's let everybody come in. First, before we start, okay. Anybody else? More people in the waiting room? No. Okay, everybody seems to be here. All right, here we are, session number 18, the chapter of Lot. I will admit that this is one of the chapters I have a sort of a love-hate relationship with. It is an interesting chapter. It addresses several different things simultaneously. I don't like, let's say, I don't like some elements of the ontology that Ibn Arabi seems to express here. It seems a little bit too fatalistic to my sort of revolutionary Shiite temperament. There's a certain element of it that is actually in dispute in the narrative of this, and that is about the status of Abu Talib. There seems to be a dispute. In some Shiite sources, for example, we believe that Abu Talib, the father of Ali alayhi salam, the Prophet's uncle, his supporter and his protector, did actually come to Islam. Many of the mainstream Sunni sources seem to disagree with this for various reasons. And also there are some Shiite sources that also disagree. But the prevalence of the consensus in several of the hadith transmissions in the Shiite sources seem to suggest very strongly that Abu Talib, the father of Ali, did in fact come into Islam before his death. Some sources say that he took the Shahada before his death. Other sources that he did it much before that. So there is no consensus about the status of Abu Talib and whether he died a pagan or non-pagan. And there's another element to this that I think Ibn Arabi is actually missing about his own ontology. By his own ontological definition of everything being Islam'd in existence, to raise the point in this chapter that Abu Talib did not come into Islam raises several very problematic issues about Ibn Arabi's own ontology. So this is something that you should keep in the back of your mind about this chapter and the way that Ibn Arabi deals with this question. Anyway, let's get cracking. It is not a long chapter, and then we will have inshallah, we'll have a fruitful discussion. Okay. So, the wisdom of mastery in the word of Lot. See if there's anybody else trying to get in here at the moment. No, everybody's in. Yeah, everybody's in. Okay. The wisdom of mastery in the word of Lot. Mastery, which in the text itself is defined as malk or malkia. Mastery implies force. And the master of a thing is one who is forceful and firm. One says, I mastered the dough when one makes it firm. Ibn al-Khatam says, describing a thrust, my hand so mastered it that I made the gaping wound pour forth. So that one in front of it could see through to the other side. That is to say, my hand made a good job of it, namely the wound. This brings to mind God saying concerning Lot, if only I had some power over you or had recourse to some firm support. The apostle of God said, may God have mercy upon my brother Lot, seeing that he had recourse to a firm support. By this he means that he was with God, who is forceful. By the words firm support, Lot means his tribe, and by the words with that I had some power, he meant resistance, which here means that power of concentration or himma peculiar to man. The apostle of God said, since that time, that is, from the time when Lot said or had recourse to some firm support, every prophet sent forth had encountered the opposition of his people and has been protected by his own tribe, Kabila, rather than Qawm, as in the case of Ali and the apostle of God. Now, this is where our translator, Mr. Austin, has made a faux pas because Ibn Arabi refers to Abu Talib. He's not referring to Ali, the son of Abu Talib. So this element of the translation here in the Austin text is actually wrong. So it should be as in the case of Abu Talib and the apostle of God. Lot said, if only I had some power over you, because he had heard the saying of God, it is God who created you in weakness as a fundamental characteristic. Then he brought about strength after weakness. The strength occurs by the divine bringing about, being an accidental strength. Then he brought about after strength, weakness, and white hair. Now, the white hair pertains to the bringing about, while the weakness is a regression of the original nature of its creation. As he says, we created you in weakness, zaf. Thus does he return him to the state in which he created him, as he says. Then he is returned to a most ignoble state, so that having enjoyed knowledge, he now knows nothing anymore. Here he indicates that he is restored to the original weakness, since with the respect to weakness, the old man is much like a child. No prophet has ever been sent until he has completed his 40th year, at which time decrease and weakness begin to set in. Because of this, he said, if only I had power over you, which requires an effective power of concentration, or himma, intentionality rather. Should you ask what prevented him from exercising such power effectively, seeing that it is evident in those of the followers who are actively on the way, and that the prophets are most entitled to it? I would reply that but you are right in one sense, you are mistaken in another. That is because gnosis allows such a power no room for maneuver, his power of concentration decreasing as his gnosis grew stronger. There are two reasons for this. The first is his confirmation of the status of servanthood and his awareness of the original characteristic of his natural creation. The second is the truth of the essential unity of the one who acts and that which is acted upon. Thus, he could not see anything other at which to direct his power of concentration, which prevented him from exerting it. In such a state of perception, he realized that his opponent had in no way deviated from his reality, as it was in its state of essential latency and non-existence. The opponent was therefore manifest in existence just as he was in a state of latency and non-existence. In no way was he transgressing the limits of his essential reality, nor had he failed to fulfill his eternally appointed role. Calling his behavior opposition is merely of accidental import, seen thus only because of the veil that obscures the eyes of men. As God says of them, most of them know not. They know the externals of this world's life, but are heedless of the hereafter. This is an inversion and relates to their saying, our hearts are enveloped. This is Ibn Arabi switching two letters in the verse he's actually quoting at the very end. Our hearts are enveloped, that is to say, by a covering that prevents them from grasping the matter as it is in reality. These and similar things restrain the Gnostic from acting freely in the world. The Sheikh Abu Abdullah ibn Qaid asked Sheikh Abu Su'ud ibn Shibli, why do you not exert your power? To which he replied, I leave God to act for me as he wills, having in mind his saying, let him be your agent. And the agent is the one who acts, for he knew God saying, spend of that which we have charged you. Now, Abu Su'ud and other Gnostics knew that the matter in hand was not his to dispose of as he willed, but that he had only been entrusted to him. God was saying to him, in effect, with regard to this matter that I've put in your charge and control, make me your agent therein. So did Abu Su'ud obey the command of God and yielded the initiative to him. How then could any power of concentration remain to be exerted by the one who truly contemplates on this matter, seeing that such a power is effective only by total concentration, which itself is not within the scope of the one exerting it, except with regard to that particular thing on which his concentration is fixed. Indeed, it is precisely this gnosis that prevents him from reaching such total concentration, since the true Gnostic manifests his gnosis by weakness and lack of power. One of the substitutes, or Abdal, said to Sheikh Abdul Razak, when you have greeted Sheikh Abu Madyan, ask him how it is that while nothing is impossible for us and many things are impossible for him, yet it is we who aspire to his station while he does not aspire to ours. This was how it was with Abu Madyan, having attained to that station and others. We, however, have attained to that station of incapacity and weakness more completely. Nevertheless, that is what the substitute, the Badal, or one of the Abdal, said to him. This matter is related to the same subject. The Prophet, speaking of God's decree to him, said of the station, I know not what will be done with me or with you. I follow only that which is revealed to me. In this station, the apostle is governed by what is revealed to him, having nothing more than that. If it was revealed to him unequivocally that he should act, he acted. But if he was restrained, then he held back. If he was given the choice, then he chose not to act unless his gnosis was deficient. Abu Sa'ud said to a trusted disciple, 15 years ago, God granted me the freedom to act, but I have not used it, thinking that it would seem an affectation. This is pompous talk. We ourselves did not leave it aside for such a reason, which implies choice in the matter, but only because of perfect gnosis. For gnosis does not leave the matter to choice, since when the Gnostic acts in the world through his power of concentration, he does so only by divine command and compulsion, not by his own choice. Now, there's a problem here, an epistemological problem grounded in an ontological one that Ibn Arabi is saying here. I find this a bit of a contradiction. Nevertheless, we have no doubt, however, but that the rank of apostleship requires freedom of action in order to effect the acceptance of his mission. Thus, there is evident in the apostle that which would confirm his veracity with his community and people, so that God's dispensation might become manifest. The same is not the case with the saint. The apostle, however, does not require it outwardly, but out of consideration for his people and not wishing to expose them too much to the irrefutable argument, the hujjat al-balagha of God, which would destroy them, preferring to preserve them. The apostle realizes that when something miraculous is shown to a group of people, some will believe what they see, others, realizing what was happening, would reject it, while others would connect it with magic and trickery so that it would not result in their desired confirmation of his mission. This is a good explanation of miracles, by the way. When, therefore, the apostles grasped this and realized that only he would believe whose heart had been illumined by God with the light of faith, and that certain people would not see by the light called faith, it became obvious that miraculous activity was useless. This is a great argument. That in itself is a gem. For this reason, the power of concentration was kept from seeking miracles, seeing that their effect was not universal in the hearts of those who witnessed them. In the case of most perfect of the apostles, the wisest of creation, the truest in state, God says, you will not guide those whom you wish to guide, rather it is God who guides them whom he wishes. The verse says actually, you will not guide those whom you love to guide. Had the power been effective, which is usually it is without doubt, then none would have used it more fitly than the apostle of God, since none enjoyed a greater and more potent power than he, although although it could not affect the conversion of his uncle Abu Talib, concerning whom the verses we have mentioned were revealed. This is why he says of the apostle that it is for him only to proclaim the message. He says, it is not your task to guide them. Rather, God guides whom he pleases. In the Surah Al-Qasas, he adds, he knows best those that are rightly guided. وَأَعْلَمْ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ. Just a second. Okay, here we are. Right, he says it is not your task to guide them, rather God guides whom he pleases. In the Surah Al-Qasas, he adds, he knows best those who are rightly guided. That is, those who have given him the knowledge of their guidance in their state of non-existence through their latent essences. This confirms the fact that knowledge is dependent on what is known, since he who is a believer in his latent essentiality and in his state of non-existence becomes manifest in that form in the state of existence. God has learned from him the fact that he would be thus. Thus, he says, he knows best those who are rightly guided. In saying this, he is really saying it is not by me that the word is changed, because what I say is determined by what I know of my creation, and I do not wrong my servants. That is, I do not decree for them the infidelity that will damn them and then require of them what is not in their power to achieve. Indeed, we treat them only in accordance with what we know of them in their latent essentiality, and what we know of them is what they give me of themselves as they are in eternity. If there is any question of wrong, it is they who are the wrongdoers. Thus, he says, it is they who wrong themselves. It is not God who has wronged them. We only say to them what our essence has given us to say to them. And our essence is too well known to us in its reality to say one thing rather than another. We say only that what we know we say, for the utterance is to ourselves from ourselves. And it is from them to comply or not once they have heard us. All is from us, meaning the divine names attached to the essence, and from them, meaning the immutable archetypal essences. It is learned from us, meaning the divine names in terms of their connection to the essence, and from them, meaning the immutable archetypal essences. Even if they are not of us, even if they are not the essence of the divine names as attached to divine essence, most surely we are of them. The divine names are the immutable archetypal essences, which are in turn attached to the essence of God. So realize, O friend, this wisdom of mastery concerning the word of Lud, for it is part of Gnosis. The mystery is now clear to you, and the matter is well explained, for that which is called Odd, meaning Al-Ahad, the one, God, the real, Al-Haq, is enshrined within the even, which means the creation. This was the chapter of Lot. So, questions, insights, revelations, queries. Anybody? All yours, Zachariah.
Yeah, so just to go back to what you said about the epistemological problem, where he says that because of the gnosis, matter is not left to choice, and that the Gnostic doesn't act by their own choice, like they act by divine command.
Yes.
And then later he says that servants don't wrong themselves; they do it by themselves. It's not something that is by divine command. So it's kind of like I'm trying to grasp like this how that works. Like if you could expand on that.
Sure. There's several different explanations that can be gleaned for that, and the first four generations of commentators are all over the place over it. The ones that come after them seem to kind of fine-hone the issue. My take on it is as follows, right? Before the attainment of awareness of the awakening of the Fana and Bago, when you become, you really become a Gnostic, when your noesis kicks in. Before that, the choice of things, should I take this road or should I take that road, occurs in an epistemic blindness, right? Whereas once the awakening occurs on very, general things, a given Gnostic, is already seeing what the consequences or what the implications of each road may or may not be in very general terms, right? So a Gnostic can only take the right road, or will usually choose to take the right road rather than the wrong one. Whereas one who's veiled doesn't know which road to take. That is the only way that this passage can be explained. I don't like Haystady's explanation of this passage at all. I think he is kind of going off on a tangent in several elements of his commentary. But by the same token, I think Ibn Arabi is phrasing this issue in a very unclear fashion, and that it could be put in much more clearer terms than he is. So that is basically my take on that passage.
Thanks. I know that there's another issue that I did have with this chapter, and that's something that I kind of thought about when I was reading the passage in the Nettler book that you had linked in the Telegram,
Yes.
and then now reading this chapter. I'm trying to understand where he says that because of your gnosis, like the true Gnostic doesn't have any worldly effect, like they're essentially their weakness increases as their gnosis increases, kind of. So there's a
I
relation there.
disagree. I completely disagree with that. I disagree with that. We have evidence throughout history of that not being accurate at all. Whether you take the example of the prophets and the saints and the real godmen of history who've had a massive impact by the exercise of their himma. Now that the argument is an academic one here between Ibn Arabi, whether himma and mashia, or himma and irada, the intentionality and the volition and the will, are synonymous terms at a certain plane. Ibn Arabi doesn't make this clear in this, at least not in this chapter at all. So then the way that he posits is that the more gnosis that you glean, the less your intentionality in the world becomes, can only be explained from one pole of the equation. And that pole of the equation is that when you have, when your gnosis is expanded, because you're seeing so far into the causality of things, right? Rather than, exert a direct influence on changing or redirecting these causalities at any point, you would rather just basically let matter stand as they are, because it is the will of God. But here's the problem. The very desire to change a given outward form of causality with a Gnostic itself is a divine impulse. And to say otherwise is to posit a duality within the ontology that you are talking about in terms of Ibn Arabi. So this is why I disagree with what he's saying, and I've actually underscored this very issue in my own forthcoming effulgences of wisdom, where I actually take Ibn Arabi to task for this very point. So a true Gnostic who has attained a divine presence and has that impulse to change, or when a choice presents itself, right, has the capacity to exert very serious influence on the world, and that is not weakness at all. And in fact, the weakness on one level that Ibn Arabi is attributing to Lot is only a Zahiri weakness. I mean, he admits this. This is implicit in this chapter, that while we're talking about weakness, this weakness is only on the level of desire. Because on the level of the batin, the question, the issue is about the power, the qudratullah, the power of God that exerts and emanates out of these prophetic figures, out of these insan al-kamil. these complete humans. So my question is, why even bring up the issue of weakness? Because that weakness is an illusion. It is an illusion only insofar as we're talking about the dynamics and the causalities of the world outside. But the fact that these people, in one way or another, always overcome their people. With Lot, if we go by the biblical narrative, then God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, and the only thing that Lot loses in this process is his wife, who turns into a pillar of salt because she turns around and looks at Sodom and Gomorrah as they're fleeing it. That narrative doesn't occur in the Quran or in the various, sirah of the prophets in the Islamic literature. But nevertheless, Lot did overcome his people. So there was no weakness. The weakness was only a fleshy, outward, Zahiri kind of weakness. So why even bring this issue up? And the case of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself, he was weak at the beginning in terms of numbers and in terms of the power of influence, but the case can be made that the manner in which the Quraysh reacted to the Prophet Muhammad, right, as the movement grew in Mecca, itself is evidence of power over them, that he had serious power. Why else would they go through, all these drastic measures of putting sanctions on all the Muslims and cutting them off from the rest of Meccan society and the things that they did? So this actually shows the power of the apostle. The apostle actually is not weak. The apostle is quite strong here. So the issue of weakness is a very illusory one. Riaz, go ahead. Riaz.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was just figuring out how to lower my hand and unmute myself. Okay, yeah, I just want to, I want to know if I'm thinking along this in the same way that you are, because like you, I read this idea about being immersed and, in a sense, being powerless as not necessarily entailing weakness. And I guess what I was thinking is there's a story, I forgot where it was. It's a Chinese story, but it's about this cook Ding. You ever hear this story?
Tell us.
Oh, so basically it's about this cook who's profiled in this Taoist text to illustrate this concept called Wu Wei, which is when you're immersed in the Tao, then all of your actions become effortless.
Yeah.
But through being effortless, through completely surrendering, you're actually much better at what you're doing. So this chef talks about this cook. He's a butcher, right? He
Yes.
talks about how his knife just essentially like flows through the
Yes.
meat and
Yeah.
carves it up perfectly. And
Yeah.
I was just thinking, if you're totally immersed in what you're doing, which is being a butcher, you're going to be totally immersed in the meat. You're not going to be thinking about some system you have in your head. Your
Yeah.
blade is literally just going to follow the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I think about here. If you're
Yeah.
truly understanding what your nature is, then
Yeah.
your nature will also follow the path of least resistance. And in
That's
that
true.
sense, you'll sort of fall into causality.
Yeah.
You won't force your way through it, you'll fall into it. And thereby you'll be probably much more effective than if you try to force things that are not in your essence onto causality. I just wanted to know if that's
No, this is completely valid explanation. And at the very beginning, when he makes that example is perfect, right? But as we move into the chapter, the explanations and the logical flow are kind of all over the place. And there's several points that I think he is at least he is contradicting himself. These aren't paradoxes; these are contradictions in that particular chapter. And then once we go back to the examples that he's drawing out of history, we find that there's other elements that could have probably been articulated in a little different way to make the same point. That's basically my issue with it.
okay. I see. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Saidi, in such
Yeah.
case, then what would be your answer? In which case the Arif should express his intentionality, power of intentionality, and in which cases he should be passive one?
This is you know the expression biding one's time, right? The expression biding one's time. If we look at the example of the 23 years of the Prophet's ministry, right? And the decisions that were taken from the very moment that he came down from the cave to the very moment that he passed away, we see that besides the prophetic mission and all of that, the Prophet exerted a very deliberate and very wise form of diplomacy, knowing when to exert force, knowing when to just basically sit back and let the chips fall where they may. He, in essence, progressively over this 23-year period, whether in the period he was in Mecca and then later on in Medina, he basically gave the Quraysh the rope by which they hanged themselves with. The actions of the Quraysh were so over the top because they were so worried about their pockets more than anything else. And the Prophet played on this, right? For example, the action in sanctioning the Muslims in Mecca and then refusing to trade with them, refusing to sell to them, refusing and just wanting to starve them out, that generated a dynamic in Mecca that created even far more sympathy from these lower classes of people in Mecca for the Muslim cause than anything else. Had these Qurayshis just left them alone and just said, just whatever, and just ignored them, so okay, whatever, do whatever you want. There is every possibility that this movement would have not gotten anywhere, right? The actions of the Quraysh, even though they had the outward power, showed their inward weakness in the face of Muhammad's preaching. And this is what gave the strength to the Muslims. And then once they make the hijrah from Mecca to Medina and basically had an entire town now under their own control with all of its denizens, that war was won right at that moment, when the Medinas made the bay'at with Prophet Muhammad. And the Prophet understood this. He understood this perfectly. And so, you know, the diplomacy, knowing when to exert force and when to just basically sit back and watch, let these people, you know, hang themselves, was brilliantly. Just like, you know, you look at the decisions that Muhammad was making, and he was a master tactician, you know, in how he brought these powerful clans of the Quraysh to checkmate at the end of this process. And so, makaru wa makarullah wallahu khairul makirin. And this, I think, it makes for a much stronger analogy to what Ibn Arabi is trying to, you know, in very general terms, trying to convey in this chapter than the example of Lot. Because we have the actual concrete examples of the actions and the decision-making that was being made by the Prophet and his companions during that period that led from being persecuted to outright victory against these people. In a 10, 15, 13 years chess match, or 23-year chess match that the Prophet played with them. Does that answer the question?
Yes, completely.
I have a question.
Go for it.
I'm trying to understand some of the paradox you're talking about between the passivity and being active, like in the case that you just described with the Prophet, peace be upon him. And I'm wondering if Ibn Arabi is describing simply more what tends to happen to the Gnostic, in that they become less, interested in the worldly ambitions and etc.
Yes.
But so that might be what happens, but that in the case the Prophet is what we should aspire to in terms of being like the perfect person as such. And I know, I mean, that's, you could discuss that in itself, but he didn't become passive in it.
Yeah. Let me put it this way. You put your finger on another very, very sensitive and good point. And that is that a Gnostic or a mystic has the luxury to basically retreat from the world and say phooey to creation. But an apostle or a saint doesn't have that luxury. They have an appointment from upstairs. Something needs to be rectified. They are the instrument of balancing something in creation. from
Yeah,
God.
they always have social responsibility of some
They have
sort
it,
when you look at
and
what they do.
that's one of their primary responsibilities. Beside the spiritual one, there's a social one involved for these individuals. So they don't have that luxury. Whereas the mystic can go sit in the cave and say to hell with creation, and these people are insane. I don't want to have anything to do with them. And God is fine with that. Fine. Go realize the infinite truths, but not the prophet messenger. They don't have that luxury. So that is the only thing. But there's a point here that I think should be understood, that I think from the point of view of theurgy is very sensitive and very true, is that as one gains more and more knowledge of things as they truly are, this desire to exert magical influence on the world ceases. I have known this in my own case, right? I went through a long period of time in my 30s reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of occult texts in Arabic and other languages. And then, especially when I got married, my desire for exerting, theurgic influence of the world completely waned.
Yeah.
And, my only desire in that area was basically just to protect my family, and that was it. And nothing more. So yes, as one kind of does increase in the path, I wouldn't use Ibn Arabi's terms, himma, the intentionality, because I believe that is always present, and also the himma in my metaphysics is directly connected to the irada, the volition, and the mashiyah, the will. So it isn't the case that it decreases, because these two elements of the divine will are always present. And that himma is basically just a prototype, the terrestrial prototype of the celestial archetypes that are the will and the volition itself. So this is where I disagree with Ibn Arabi. I think he's being a little bit inconsistent in his terminology. But in terms of exerting a sort of magical or paranormal influence on the world, yes, as you do progress in the path, that desire begins to wane. And it wanes for a very simple reason, because you also begin to understand, not just theoretically, but on a very empirical and practical level, the causalities that are actually involved in things, right? Like time, preparedness, the istidad that Ibn Arabi is talking about. There's this wonderful passage that I found in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah that I put on the theurgy list, where in very concise terms, Ibn Arabi explains, the dynamics of prayer and why some prayers are answered and why many are not. And the non-answer of a prayer has nothing to do with the side of the divine. The divine only says yes to every request. But your preparedness, your istidad, is what determines whether that thing will actualize or not. And this is something that I see very little discussion of, even in the New Age circles who talk about, manifestation and all that kind of stuff. If you do not have the receptivity to receive something, you don't get it. Right?
Yeah.
So I had this discussion with one of my neighbors several years ago, where we had this exact same discussion. And she said to me, well, then why do some people win the lottery and others don't? And the answer is obvious to me, is because those people who win the lottery have the receptivity to win the lottery, while others didn't have that receptivity. Now, why they did or why they didn't, that is a completely different discussion that can go into all kinds of areas. But nevertheless, the answer is there. They had the receptivity while others didn't have. They had the preparedness and others didn't have. It's as simple as that. So, and it's not even a case of, whether you deserve or not, because what you deserve is something that is also determined by yourself, right? It's not something that the outside necessarily even prepares for you. You are doing it for yourself. So if you have created the adequate istidad, the adequate preparedness for yourself, then you become that that qabel, that receiving receptacle to receive whatever it is that you're asking for. Whereas if you don't, then you don't. So then you have to work on becoming that reception, that proper receptacle.
I just this week saw someone post about a Native American concept of sacrifice, that you can't just get things endlessly. There has to be some sort of sacrifice made, meaning like what the person is willing to give up
Yeah.
to receive something. And I would say also, there I mentioned Carlos Castaneda talks quite a bit about that with, you know, the idea of the room that has to be freed up. Do you feel that those are echoed in anything Ibn Arabi talks about, or that you've come across in Islam, or?
Sure, by implication. I mean, Ibn Arabi doesn't get into some of the nitty-gritties. He just lays out the general principles of some of these things. Occasionally, he'll throw in a couple of examples here and there. But yeah, I mean, yes, these things are definitely involved. You know, whether it comes from sacrifice, a sacrifice doesn't necessarily have to be a literal thing. It can also be a mental thing. You know, but yeah, I mean, basically clearing up your life, you know, clearing up your room, setting things in their proper place, which is a refrain that Ibn Arabi constantly uses, is very much what is called for, to create an adequate receptacle of yourself, a adequate istidat to receive what you are asking for. Because God is not saying no to anything. You know, God gives, you know, is, you know, you know, the body, you know, he's the giver, the originator of everything. He gives. He gives. You say, Daddy, I want this, throws it at you. But whether you can catch the ball being thrown your way, that's a completely different conversation. Yeah. Khadija.
Sorry, I'm done.
Okay.
No, I'm good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Khadija, go ahead.
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. So I'm just pausing with the receptivity. And I guess part of where the question comes, especially, you know, when people lead meditations and you do ask the recipient to become open and to become receptive. And is that something, I guess it's a twofold, which is in that moment, do you have the ability to open up that avenue? And then is it also generally in this realm of receptivity, is this a conscious thing or is this unconscious also, where maybe from beliefs and things that are holding someone back that they're not aware of? And I'll leave it there, bismillah.
That is a long discussion, because for each person it's a different thing. It's a unique case, right? A lot of people are resistant to these sorts of things. I've seen it myself in many similar kind of meditation circles where, you know, a facilitator will say these sorts of things and people will resist it, even if they're, you know, like, even for example, I used to go to a lot of chiropractors or massage therapists, and the guy said would relax, and I would tell myself mentally to relax, but my body wouldn't relax, right? Until I kind of learned that secret as well, and how to do that, so then my spine could be properly decompressed by the doctor. In a meditative setting, these things are learned. You know, how to become passive, to be a proper receptacle, requires learning in and of itself. Because, you know, there's a lot of different psychological things going on. Some of them may not even be psychological. It could be physical, whatever they are. So unless these basic elements are worked through, telling somebody in a group meditation to become a passive receptacle usually doesn't get anywhere. You know, first, you know, the person has to work through whatever issue it is, whatever veils there are that are not allowing them to relax and be passive receptacles, and then you can get to that part, to being an adequate receptacle. Yeah. And this takes work. It's not something that you do in 1 or 2 sessions.
SubhanAllah. I think you just said it very beautifully, Sidi, in terms of the veils that are holding them back from being able to receive fully. Which also ties into a little bit of I think you mentioned very important part, SubhanAllah, in terms of as your knowledge increases, or there's that desire just diminishes. And I think, I guess, I don't know if this is a question as much as it's been the two edges of what Ibn Arabi is saying, and what you mentioned in context of passivity and activity, being active in terms of the role, which is when you feel that there is a specific command that's coming forward, that it's not out of desire, but out of fulfillment of, there's no question within your being. And is that really what you were highlighting in terms of the discussion earlier?
Yes.
I guess that's.
Yeah. Yeah. When you are in that awakened state, or if you've entered, as they say, the stream of the infinite ocean, then the question from that point onwards is how far you deepen in. But once you're there, you're there. So choice from that point onwards is informed, as opposed to the other state where you're misinformed because you don't know what each of these variables are going to be on each of the sides of the decision. But once you are awake, you know, your intuition, your himma, your ma'rifah is so strong that you can see the difference between one or the other in general details. Maybe not in the particulars. You can actually see it. And this in itself opens up a lot of different, questions about a lot of events in history. Why would the prophets and the saints, for example, choose the path that would lead to their persecution or martyrdom? And in one sense, the only answer to that question is that any other path was impossible for them and may have even been worse. So what did actually, the avenue that actually did open up, that they did choose to take, was the best possible option to take.
SubhanAllah. Barakallah feek, Sidi. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sidi, I would like to other question about the explanation of miracles. When a prophet or a arif, wali, performs miracle, always a typological situation. There are three types of groups. The one who see the miracle, believe in it, and outward express their iman, the first group. The second group, those who very well understand the miracle, but out of maybe envy or hatred or some other purpose, they reject it. And the third people, the confused people. I want you to elaborate little more on the third group, the confused people and their status.
The confused people, which is the generality of humanity, the Amma, right, don't know what to believe. That is the problem. Let's take, for example, just the history of Islam itself, the early history of Islam, from a persecuted minority community in Mecca to the dominant group in 23 years, in a culture that for several thousand years, at least 2,000 that we know on a sort of a semi-recorded basis in the way that it operated, transformed like that at the hands of a statesman, a prophet messenger like Muhammad. If anybody has even an iota of fairness, of assessment of that situation, this in itself is a miracle. How Muhammad, with no resources, with opposition of the kind that he witnessed, not just in Mecca, but also amongst the Arabs of Ta'if and the surrounding areas who were doing business with the Qurayshis of the Mecca, how he managed in that short period of time of transforming that society, of overthrowing its ruling classes with nothing at the very beginning of his mission, other than what he claimed he had of the vision that he had and the calling that he had been given from above, right? So there was something to what this man was and what this man did that was beyond the ordinary, right? And if you deny that, then you need to explain with the evidence available as to why he wasn't extraordinary and why not somebody else other than Muhammad. Like there were contenders simultaneously around at that time, like Musaylima, right? But Musaylima's movement didn't get anywhere. He had only 1 or 3 or 4 followers. But Muhammad managed to both attract a large number of people within Mecca itself, then later Medina, then in the surrounding villages and towns, and in a very short period of time. In fact, that the actual conquest of the Muslims of that area was less than 13 years. And for a society back then, 1400 years ago, in an environment such as Arabia of that time, that is unbelievable what the Prophet pulled off, right? So how can anybody look at this and nitpick is the question I have. I have no problem in people delving into critical history and talking about influences and all that. That's fine, talk about it, because some of these are present and some of these are debatable. But the fact of the matter is that what Muhammad ibn Abdullah pulled off is a miracle. And so if nothing else, all of these naysayers and Islamophobes that we have, at minimum, should elevate Muhammad to the status of an Alexander the Great or some of the great statesmen that we have in history, rather than to quibble and constantly mudsling and that sort of thing. And this is where I think the third category of people, those who don't know, those who are confused, would cease to be confused if Muslims themselves acted a little bit more rational and presented these sorts of facts to the people. One of the best histories of Islam that I think has ever been written in English is Marshall Hodgson's 3-volume The Venture of Islam. And this man was a secular atheist historian, but the appreciation that he had for the character of Muhammad himself and what Muhammad pulls up comes through his analysis, especially in the first volume of the book. Another one is Montgomery Watt and his 2 volumes of study about Muhammad. One is called Muhammad in Mecca and then Muhammad in Medina, the Statesman. And they, as secular Western historians, completely understood what was going on, right? If we presented Islam in that kind of an analytical, historical, critical kind of framework and looked at all the variables, right, then the question as to why the Muslims won out and others did not becomes very apparent, and that there was something else, that what these Muslims did and what Muhammad and the personality and the charisma that he had possessed was something of a much different quality than a lot of people understand. So all this quibbling, and that these silly Islamophobes usually do, kind of misses the point. And unfortunately, the Muslims themselves are not the best, advertising agents, as it were. Oftentimes, I think your screen is frozen. That's that.
So I froze for the last 2 or 3 seconds. Now, on more personal level, from the perspective of the confused people, how to say it? Is it, let's say, something which happens by his voluntary actions, let's say, because he just doesn't care, and the result of his carelessness is this result that it is confused, or it could be also a person who is honest person, but just the situation in which he finds himself is confusing.
I think all of the above probably are contributing factors, sure. All of the above.
So can we give to him some level of excuse?
Well, we can give him a level of excuse in that he doesn't know better, and that the cause and effects and the chain of causalities that are influencing his life veil him from seeing the truth as it is. And so these various factors make this person, in the greater scheme of things, ghafil, neglectful of understanding the true cause of things. Yeah, sure, we can look at it that way. And this is why there's such an exhortation in the Quran and in the Hadith literature for people, even the average people, to constantly be mindful of things, never take anything for granted, right? To always be on your toes where Allah subhanahu is concerned. Not to fall into complacency. This attitude of complacency is one of the things that is continually criticized in a variety of contexts about the human being throughout the Quran, and especially in the Surah Al-Baqarah, which is, in my opinion, as a piece of scripture, is one of the best, psychological texts of scripture that we have in any world literature. And if people understood the kind of dialectic that the Quran is talking about, the human psychology, then, and internalize that, then they would cease from being confused, right? Because at that point they would be able to see the signs and the direct activity of the real in the world at all times, right?
And just one last thing before wasting too much of your time.
No.
So, what you said in the beginning, that the third group is the state of generality.
Yeah.
But in some sense, the same way the Gnostics who understand and see to the reality of things, they are a small group. Exactly in the same way, the active kafirs and rejectors who see the things, but they reject it, they're also a small group. And the majority of people are in the third group who just follow the mainstream.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you
Because
very
the
much.
kuffar, just remember, without, in English, when this word is translated, kafir, is usually translated as infidel, whereas the actual meaning of kafir is someone who covers something up, right? When you cover something, the mastar verb kafara or kafira means to cover something, right? So the kuffar, or the infidels, are really those who can see the truth but cover it up because it is against their interest to recognize it, right? If they gave, if they acquiesced, if they went taslim, then they think that they would lose something. And this has been the case throughout history. You can argue that the narrative of Jesus in the Gospels and his conflict with the Pharisees and the Sadducees is about that very thing, because they saw the power of this man, of Jesus alayhi salam, but they chose to oppose him, because if they gave in to him, then that means their power was at risk. But yet, arguably, whatever the Jesus movement was, one of the causalities in which brought down that very establishment within a 60-year period, shorter, 60 years after the death of Jesus, was precisely their not acquiescing or failing to see an opportunity in the figure of Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam, right? So, they were blind. They saw the truth, but they were blind as to the causalities around that. And so they chose to oppose. And by opposing, they brought themselves eventually down. Jeff.
Speaking of Jesus, I want to replace the word weakness that we were stumbling over before with the word meekness. Maybe that's what Ibn Arabi meant. Maybe he didn't mean weak as in powerless. Maybe he meant
no. He uses the word zaf and zaif, which in Arabic means weakness. That's the standard definition. However, as a kind of a secondary implication rather than a primary one, that does have the implication of meekness as well. But there are other words that convey that, and he didn't use those. So because in the Quran, Lot and his narrative kind of revolves around this element, right? I think this is one of the reasons why Ibn Arabi chose to kind of emphasize, at least on the level of language and expression, that particular thing. But then as you go into the chapter itself, this is why I think this is one of the reasons why I don't like this chapter very much, is because I know what he's trying to say, and the way he's expressing it could have been expressed a lot different way to express exactly the point that he tries to convey in that chapter, rather than the way that he articulated.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. It's not a bad chapter, but I don't have any other questions.
Okay.
But the whole time you were talking about the weakness in the world, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking, well, yeah, anyway, I told you what I thought, but yeah, because I agree with you. Obviously, the closer, the more receptive you become to, divine influence, as it were, to put it like that. Obviously, your influence in the world becomes stronger and more powerful, not the other way. So the weakness he's talking about is not weakness in that sense where that you don't have any effect, but it must be like an internal condition that maybe you kind of impose on yourself, or is imposed on you due to your humility in the face of awe, for one thing, for example. So anyway, that's it.
Does he mean weakness as in, like, does he maybe mean in contrast to the sort of physical prowess and cockiness of youth?
Yes.
So because we associate the word weakness with being feeble.
Well,
but can you speak to the word a bit more?
Yeah, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about weakness in terms of feebleness, and so he brings in the analogy of age, and that the prophets, by and large, are physically or outwardly feeble, right? So they cannot exert that kind of, physical, zahiri kind of prowess on their enemies. They can't just go out and duke it out physically with their nemesis. But yet they manage to, at the end at least, overcome their enemies. But they're, like I just said to Jeff, there are different ways to express this in a far more clear way than he does in this particular chapter. And because the way that he expresses it in this chapter can lead to confusion, and the feebleness is only on an outward level; it's not on an inward level. Someone can look and appear feeble, but
yeah, so he's talking about elders.
Yeah, elder, but internally they embody the essence of strength itself.
Well, that's what it really, the definition of it, isn't it?
Yeah,
of being an elder. Yeah, but do you think that comes down to him explaining it poorly, or it could be about the sort of lexicon available at the time and the translation?
Both. But then, when, for example, one reads in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, his real magnum opus, he does express these issues in a far more clear and better analytical way. And he brings some far better examples and that sort of thing than he does in this particular chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Hussein, did you have questions? Yes, you did.
Just to add my 2 cents as I'm thinking through the same questions. I was thinking about da'af also I think in the terms that Jeff was thinking of them in, of that word in, where it's more so there's the reference to like youth and old age, but then he's also immediately talking about ubudiyah, right? And page 158, he goes into talking about the 2 reasons why the Gnostic doesn't exert power. The first reason is his confirmation of the status of servanthood and his awareness of the original characteristic of this natural creation. So I was thinking of it in terms of like achieving the state of ubudiyah, which, and I'm also thinking about that just read that hadith by Imam Sadiq where he talks about the relationship between ubudiyya and rububiyyah, that it's almost this like Taoist kind of thing where at the heart of ubudiyya is
It's rububiyyah.
rububiyyah, so that by virtue of like maybe like emptying oneself out in a state of servanthood, that one is invested with power, which that's the more like internal way of looking at it. That's
I
how
think
I
that
was
hadith that you just quoted from As-Sadiq alayhi salam is a much clearer exposition of what Ibn Arabi is trying to say in that entire chapter. I love that hadith, because that's exactly the Wu way that was referred to earlier. But I think the expression is a little bit off. Is my problem with it? The principle is sound. What he's saying is spot on, but the way that he's expressing it is not all that clear. I mean, can confuse, and it sounds like he's contradicting himself.
Those are also the words that I was reading Ibn al-Farid's poetry, and he's talking about this in relation to the divine feminine. And he uses the word, those two words, da'af and ajiz, right, incapacity. So again, that kind of spiritual aspect of that weakness.
Yeah. Okay, well, this was the chapter of Lot. Next one we have is the chapter of Ezra, or Uzair in the Arabic. This is not a bad chapter. I actually like this next chapter quite a lot. And the zikr associated with it is the zikr of Ya Qadir. So start on that zikr, O powerful. And we will meet up again next week with this next chapter of Ezra. So until then, everybody have a great week. Ya Malakum.